Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Karen Ware Jackson, and I'm the webinar coordinator for PRC, Practical Resources for Churches. We're a nonprofit ecumenical resource center offering workshops, resources, consultants, and webinars to congregations and individuals. We're able to offer these webinars and our free online resource center to everyone for free, thanks to the support of our members. You can see on the screen our member judicatories. These are regional, generally governing bodies that subscribe for all the churches that they represent. So if you belong to one of those, make sure to thank your staff for their support of PRC. But you can also join PRC as an individual or as a church or ministry. And the great thing about being a member of PRC is that you don't just have access to our free resources, but you have access to our consultants. At PRC, we say everyone has a calling and ours is helping you. That means that if you have a question from QuickBooks to curriculum to copyrights, you can call us up, you can send us an email, and we are going to help you out. We're going to help you find the answer to your question. The other thing we have for our members, we have cohorts on Christian education, on spirituality. We're working on cohorts on church leadership and finance starting in the spring, and other special members-only workshops and events that are really great. And so we encourage you to consider membership to PRC, and I am going to put some links in the chat which you can use to explore a little bit more about who we are and what we offer. Speaking of the things we offer, I know everyone loves the free webinars, so I want to make sure you know about a few we have coming up. Next Tuesday, November 1st, at 7 p.m., we have a webinar with Rachel Keefe on the Life-Saving Church, Faith Communities, and Suicide Prevention. It's a really important topic. The next day, on Wednesday, November 3rd, we have a webinar with Kay Katan that is on common obstacles for faith formation. It's part of her series on creating a discipleship pathway. And then coming up on Tuesday, November 15th, I think particularly for those of you all here, you might be interested in our webinar with Laura Allery on Here, the Dot We Call Home, which is her new children's book. And I'm going to put links to all of those in the chat in just a minute. But we are so grateful that you are here today to learn about raising race-wise families in a race-challenged world. We're grateful to have the author Helen Lee with us. She's the Director of Product Innovation at InterVarsity Press and the author and co-author of multiple books, including The Race-Wise Family, The Missional Mom, and Growing Healthy Asian American Churches. She and her husband, Brian, are the blessed parents of 3 fast-growing boys in college and high school, and they live in the Chicagoland area. Helen, we're so grateful you are here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate that gracious invitation to be here with you all. And thank you all for taking the time to be on this webinar. I hope and pray it is a useful resource for everyone. I love this topic, so I'm excited to be speaking on it with you today and to get our minds just starting to move in the direction of the things we'll talk about. Let me ask you a question. Just think about it. You don't have to, if you want to, you can put answers in the chat. But in your own mind, I want you just to think about this question. What do you picture when you imagine the typical American family? What do you picture when you imagine the typical American family? For a long time, here was my answer. This is going to date me, but I'm going to share it anyway. This is what I imagined when I imagined the typical American family. If this family is not familiar to you, because you're a little younger than me, this is, of course, the Brady Bunch, the Brady Bunch. And if your family looks like this, this is not a critique. You know, many American families look like this, just, often without the live-in housekeeper. But of course, even in the 1980s, when I was watching this particular show, not every American family looked like this family. My family didn't look like this family, but I thought this was the norm. I thought this was the ideal, actually. And so I would always compare, my family to the Brady's, and my family would always come up short in one shape or form. Another thing I'm going to just share with you by way of personal story to get us into this topic. It's something that happened to me when I was in 6th grade. So I was in the classroom filling out a form, and the teacher came around and looked over all of our shoulders. And then she just made this announcement all of a sudden. She said, now everybody here in the room, you all will check that box that says white, except you, Helen, you're going to check that box that says Asian. And I just remember in that moment, although of course I knew I was Korean, but something about the way that this interaction happened, it just made me feel really ashamed to be Asian. I'm sharing these stories as a bit of a precursor to paint a picture of what America is like if you're growing up here as a person of color, because one of the first steps to becoming race wise is to become more race aware, and especially regarding those dynamics that those of us who are people of color or minorities in the United States experience. There's a marginalization that can happen, I think, especially for those of us who are people of color. You don't see yourself reflected in pop culture or in the media as much. And, since the Brady Bunch first came out in the 70s and 80s, decades and decades since then, there have been hundreds and hundreds of shows and sitcoms and dramas that have depicted white or largely white families. Let me ask you to guess how many shows since that time have depicted Asian or Asian American families or largely Asian families. The answer to that question, just for fun, just two. Just two shows over decades and decades and decades have depicted Asian American families. Is that something that you ever noticed? I ask you that question not to provoke any guilt or any shame. I'm pretty sure that likely the folks gathered here or watching the webinar are not the ones responsible for the lack of representation that exists in popular culture. And even if you are in that industry, it is never too late to grow, it is never too late to learn, and it's never too late to change. And if you're here today, I applaud you because you're showing a willingness to engage in a topic and a conversation that's not always easy. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. And it's not always our nature to seek after that, which makes us uncomfortable. So again, I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to be here today. It shows that you have an initiative inside you, a willingness to learn, a willingness to engage with a topic that I think is so important and so relevant for our current time. So again, I hope and pray there will be good content here for you to take with you. Well, speaking of typical American families, this is my typical American family. And in fact, actually, I am married to a Canadian. So our three boys here are Korean, American, Canadian. 100% all three. It's like the Trinity. So over the years, we've talked to our boys a lot about the fact that they are all three of these things, that they are Korean by ethnicity, that they are American and Canadian by nationality, and what a gift all of those things are, all those different connections. But something happened a couple of years ago that really cemented their Korean Canadian identity in particular. And I'm going to make another pop cultural reference because I do like pop culture. But that instance was this show. This is a picture depicting the cast of the show Kim's Convenience, which was a Netflix sitcom that appeared a few years ago featuring a Korean Canadian family. And I first started watching it and was amazed that I experienced something I'd never before experienced in viewing sitcom television, which is someone who sounded like my own dad, someone who sounded like my own uncles, someone who really depicted an experience, even though it was set in Canada, that resembled my own. And my son, Jason, who you saw in the other picture, had this immediate reaction when he started watching this show. He said, "It sounds like home." They felt this immediate affinity with this particular Korean North American family. And this wonderful, delightful show, if you've ever had a chance to experience it, helped my kids feel more affirmation in their ethnic identity than anything they'd ever heard from the church. I think as Christians, we're really good at certain things. We're really good at teaching about discipleship. We're really good at teaching about reading and studying the Bible. We learn about Christian community and the importance of it. We learn how to celebrate all the major Christian events in the Christian calendar, Christmas, Easter, Lent. We learn how to pray and fast and engage in spiritual disciplines. But in this area of race and ethnicity, this is an area that we're not as good at as the church. Talking about race and ethnicity, training ourselves as adults or our kids in understanding issues of race and ethnicity. It's not part of most Sunday school curriculum, as far as I know. It's not often even touched on in the pulpit. I'm someone, as you heard earlier, who grew up in the 70s and 80s as someone who was one of very few or one of the only person of color in my classroom or in other various contexts. And I didn't never really told my parents about my own experiences of racial bullying. And over time, the net result for me was that I just didn't want anything to do with being Korean. I would be the person in our family who we'd sit down to dinner and everybody else was using chopsticks, and I would defiantly go grab a fork to proclaim that I don't want anything to do with anything Asian. I would tell my parents, I'm never marrying a Korean American. I made good on that promise. As you heard earlier, I married a Korean Canadian. So, God has a sense of humor, clearly. And it wasn't until I was about 20 years old, at the end of my time in college, that I finally heard this beautiful healing message that God created me as a Korean person. He gifted me with Korean ethnicity, and that was a blessing and not a curse. It wasn't some sort of cosmic judgment or an accident. It was his intentional choice to bless me. Is that a message that you've often heard in the church, communicated clearly from the pulpit or in our teaching, that ethnic identity for each and every one of us, because we all have an ethnic identity, is a gift from God? This is just one of those areas where the church has not exercised a lot of muscle to be able to grow and learn and teach. And so we just end up picking up whatever the culture is teaching us. Now, I've already used these words. I've already used words like culture and ethnicity and race. So let's stop for a quick moment and do some definitions, some very quick definitions. So let's talk about, these are very, very simple, just to keep it easy. So you could do a deep dive on any one of these, but for the purposes of time, we're just going to breeze through them. So the word culture is complicated and incorporates so many different things, but I'm going to simplify it for the purposes of this discussion. This is not all encompassing as a definition, but the way we're using it today, culture is a person's whole way of life, including their stories, their value, their convictions, their activities, and other things you see on that illustration of the culture wheel. So for example, culturally, I'm American. I was born here, grew up here my whole life. Culturally, I'm also Midwestern. I was spending many, many years of my adolescence on the East Coast, but I now live here in Chicagoland and have been here for 20 years. So I think of myself culturally as a Midwesterner. I'm a Gen Xer for all that entails. So those are just some little clues as to what defines me culturally. Lots of different things, right? And all of you will have different elements to your particular cultural background. Let's talk now about ethnicity. Now, ethnicity is a social group that shares a common and distinctive heritage, and that can also possibly include elements of culture and language and religion. Not always, but sometimes. So, for example, the woman you see depicted on the screen here is from North Korea. She's North Korean, um, and she and I share a common ethnicity. We are both culturally and ethnically Korean. So we share that even though we're very different in other ways, but in terms of our ethnicity, our ethnic background, our ethnic heritage, we share that in common. The word ethnicity, by the way, stems from the Greek word ethnos, which you will see all over the New Testament. It's one of the reasons I love the word ethnos and ethnicity, because it's got a root that I think is very biblical. And it's something, if you start looking for it, anytime you see the word nation translated in the New Testament, that is this word ethnos, from which we get the word ethnicity. Now, race. Now, we could talk for hours about race, so I'm very much going to simplify this, but we're going to use race in this way today. The categorization, wow, that's a tongue twister. The categorization of people based on common physical features, most often skin color, and the resulting systems and structures that create inequities due to those categories. So racial constructs have been in existence in our country for a long time, going all the way back to the 1700s, to be honest. It's important to understand that these are categories that have been created really initially for political reasons. And so these categories have been in place for a while. They also have been shifting. If you look at the categories that were used back in the 1700s and categories that we use now, they're different. But in any case, categories such as white, Black, and then Asian, in my case, are the kinds of things we are talking about when we're talking about racial categories. That word Asian, just as a side note, is so simplistic because it incorporates so many different cultural groups. I think at last count, more than 50 groups just here in the United States can be lumped together in that word Asian. So it's important to understand that that word is very, very, again, just a broad term used with lots of distinctions and distinctiveness incorporated within. And then racism, a system of advantage or preferential treatment or assumed value differences based on racial categories. This idea that if you are a certain race, you are in some way, shape, or form better than or valued more than those from others, from other racial groups. So that's very quick set of definitions. And by the way, if you're curious to know if these slides will be available after the presentation, absolutely, I can make sure that these get to Karen's hands so they can be part of your learning for the future. So you don't have to furiously take notes if you don't want to. All right, so it's important to be comfortable with these terms, to be able to talk about them within your family, your churches, with kids, so that they can too understand these kinds of distinctions and differences, because part of our discipleship is to help our kids understand what's a Christian way to think about all these things and what is not. So for the time that my kids were born, you can see them there as little people. We have verbalized to them that they are ethnically Korean, that ethnic Korean heritage is a gift. So all of our kids, they have Korean middle names that we've passed down through generations. They have celebrated Korean customs with us, as you can see. We love eating Korean food. We watch K-dramas with them. And so they've grown up understanding that Koreanness is a gift and they love being Korean. That's what they tell me. So that warms my heart. But here's the thing, despite like decades now of training and trying to disciple our kids to embrace their God-given ethnicity as a gift, it has not been enough. So whether we realize it or not, the next generation is constantly absorbing messages all the time, all around them, that can feed into their self-understanding about these issues of race. And it can play out in different ways. So one night when my eldest, Jason, was in junior high school, we were talking before he was heading to bed. He said to me, "Mom, I'm not handsome." And I said, "Well, I disagree, but what, what makes you say that?" And so we began talking some more, and I realized through our conversation that he was looking around and seeing kind of the social structures of junior high school and noticing that for the first part, he was one of very, very few people of color. For the second point, everyone he thought of as being popular or important were all white. And so he was making a value judgment in his own head. I'm less valuable. I'm less handsome. I'm less preferred. I'm less important because I'm Asian. Author and psychologist Beverly Tatum writes this about a phrase she calls cultural racism. It's like a smog in the air. Sometimes it's so thick that it's visible, but other times it's less apparent. But we're always day in and day out breathing it in. So, even if we're trying to be intentional to create spaces where all of us, adults and kids alike, understand that God's given us ethnicity and ethnicity is a gift, it's God intended, God designed, it's a blessing. Even so, as a result of this cultural context we're growing up in here in the US, and as a result of our own broken, sinful, fallen selves, racial brokenness still exists in our country. We know this, and will probably continue to exist. this side of heaven. I don't think anyone would dispute that fact. In fact, in recent years, we've seen a number of ways that racism has reared its ugly head, right? In the church and beyond. We've seen a lot of people use this phrase, racism is a virus, and racial brokenness has a lot of similarities to COVID. It's a hidden, invisible virus sometimes that surrounds us. Sometimes it's very overt, but often there's a lot happening inside each one of us that leads to the brokenness we see externally. Many of us carry it around without realizing it. Sometimes we infect other people with it, either intentionally or unintentionally. And at its core, racism in all its forms, in all its prejudices, is a sin. This is why the church can talk about issues of race in a way that ultimately have eternal significance. And it's different from how the rest of the world, the rest of the secular culture talks about racism. We can identify it for what it is, which is it is a sin. And so on this side of eternity, it's not going away, as I mentioned. And just in the same way that we have to kind of safeguard ourselves against COVID and other viruses that are invisible and out there and that have like detrimental effects, we need to do the same with this area of race to guard ourselves against racism and racial injustice. So, how do we do this? What are some of the ways that we can defend ourselves and the next generation effectively against this virus of racial sickness? I'm going to give you 4 specific suggestions. First one, wear masks. Masks of vigilance. So what do I mean by this? I think that American Christians have previously been able to kind of ignore, especially those of us in the dominant culture, pretty much ignore issues of race and racial injustice that have happened to, in particular, Black and Brown Americans. We could just kind of look away if we didn't want to deal with it. We could just kind of ignore those issues if they weren't really ours to manage or deal with. And I would say even in the church, there's kind of pressure, even from some segments of Christians, to not talk about racial issues. It's divisive. Let's just be colorblind. Why do we have to talk about it? But if we don't address the issues, if we're not vigilant to watch for the ways that this virus of racial sickness is all around us, and even in the church, as well as the larger communities, if we don't put on those masks of vigilance, it will continue to infect us and those around us. I'm going to tell another story about my son, Jason. When he, again, was in junior high school, a lot of things happen to kids in junior high school. But when he was in junior high school, he was on a little league baseball team. And he experienced some pretty overt racial bullying from some of his teammates. These were boys he had never previously met who didn't know him at all. They started throwing racial taunts at him in person. And then they posted those very same words on an Instagram page. And, we're talking about a well-resourced, well-educated community outside of Chicagoland. So I took a screenshot. I shared it with the coach, and I said, you need to be aware that there's this kind of racial bullying happening among your players. We were lucky because in this case, the coach was himself a Latino man whose own son had experienced some of the same kind of bullying. And now he had some evidence to be able to take back to the superiors of the Little League board who suspended those boys for a few games. And I didn't even know any of these families. I didn't know who the parents were. It wasn't clear to me who the parents were. So I had no idea who to talk to about this. But one of the moms actually came and talked to me. And she said, I want to apologize for what my son did. I had absolutely no idea he was even capable of saying things like this. I don't know where he got the idea that this language is acceptable. I'm so sorry. So I was appreciative of her apology, but he got the idea because this is the air that surrounds us, whether we realize it or not. And it surrounds our kids, whether they realize it or not, that it's okay to act this way if no one is explicitly pointing out those areas of brokenness, if no one is explicitly helping our kids to understand that they need to be able to be vigilant against this kind of behavior, then they'll just go ahead, they'll go ahead and keep breathing that air and passing along the virus to others. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 13 is a really famous description as to how we're to prepare ourselves, in the face of evil. And you can see the verses on the screen. This idea of putting on the full armor of God, this idea of our struggle. When it comes to struggling against evil, we're talking about fighting against the principalities of darkness. So this is spiritual work we're doing to make it really, really clear. When we're talking about eradicating racial brokenness in this world, this requires the full armor of God, including masks of vigilance. And it means that we need to understand this is a battle that we have to fight on our knees in prayer, as well as recognizing that it's an invisible battle sometimes, at times. If this boy who had taunted my son had just gone on, imagining it's okay for me to do this, it's just funny, it's just something fun to do. If he had gone on thinking that way, his mom would never have known he was harboring this virus inside him. Decades could have gone by where he might have thought this is fine to do. And maybe he would have caused pain elsewhere in his adult life as a result. So this is why we have to be vigilant, because the invisible virus that is racism is all around us. And this is exactly what Satan intends. Satan wants it to be invisible. What else can we do? Secondly, we can inoculate ourselves with lament. Okay, so lament. Seung-Chan Rah is a professor currently at Fuller Seminary. He wrote a wonderful and profound book called Prophetic Lament. And he talks about the fact that lament is the truth telling that we need, that allows and in fact demands the voice of the suffering be brought front and center. How often in our churches and in our families are we lamenting with our kids over racial injustices that are happening in the nation and the world? How much are we setting aside time to do that and to teach our kids that this is a really important spiritual practice? As we engage in lament, we are inoculated more and more. And what that actually means is that we find ourselves, it's an interesting kind of inoculation. It protects us from the racial violence and the racial brokenness of our world by breaking our heart, if that makes any sense. That's the kind of inoculation that lament does. It opens our heart and opens our souls to beyond just like a mental understanding that racial trauma is out there. It starts to affect us personally, such that we begin to care more and more, which is how God wants us to engage with the world and the problems of the world. He needs for our hearts to be broken with the things that break his heart. Ruth Haley Barton is a spiritual director, well-known author, and I appreciate what she says about the prayer of lament. It's that unsettling biblical tradition of prayer that includes expressions of complaint and anger and grief and despair and protest to God. And many of us have never been taught this way of praying. It's often missing in the worship of many congregations. So in our churches, in our families, what more can we do to bring lament into our spiritual disciplines and practices? Just a word of warning, everything in us and everything in our culture pushes us as far away from lament as possible. Our sin nature, Satan's lies and deception, they're all going to try to lure us into comfort and being blinded by and hard-hearted to the pain of racial brokenness around us. None of us want to seek after this, to be honest. We don't usually seek after lament because it hurts. Like a shot, like a good shot, it hurts. But sometimes we need the pain of the shot to get better and to better protect ourselves from deeper harm. And that's what lament can do. Thirdly, let me skip these for now because I know we're getting behind on time. Let's see here. Sorry. My presentation is doing some crazy things right now. There we go. Sorry about that. So thirdly, we are going to pursue the healing of past wounds. We're going to pursue the healing of past wounds. I have a friend, she's a Korean American woman. To this day, she really struggles with interacting with African American women. It stems from a trauma she had many years ago. It was a scary incident. It wasn't violent or abusive, but it was a scary moment that had an impact on her when she was a child that she has never really pursued healing for. And even now, she's in her 50s, it still causes a barrier for her to be able to interact with Black women. It's possible that you might carry some incidents of racial trauma, either experienced or caused. Either way, it could be true for your family members, it could be true for your children. Are there unresolved issues that cause tension that are buried deep within that need to be resolved? Boy, I'm going to tell another story about Jason. I need to get some other stories from my other kids. But Jason now is in college. He's at the University of Iowa. He's the one who experienced that racial taunting I told you about earlier in middle school. So one day recently, he was walking along on campus and he heard his name being called. He turned around, and wouldn't you know it, it's one of the boys in middle school who caused pain in his life with some racial bullying and racial taunting. And they had not talked like since those many, many years prior when the bullying had happened. And that young man said to my son, I need to apologize to you for all that horrible stuff I did, all those horrible things I said to you in middle school. You know, I have had time to look back on what I did and to relive it, and I know how wrong it was. I really need to say I'm sorry and ask for your forgiveness. He had taken that time to search his soul, to do the painful work of dealing with past trauma. And luckily, he had had the opportunity to make amends. And sometimes I wish more of us adults had the maturity to do the same, to take the time to do that kind of soul work that's needed to be able to address some of those areas of racial brokenness in our own lives. This is an ongoing process. It's not a once and done kind of thing. Even myself, you know, as a 50-year-old woman of color, I still do things that cause instances of pain and that I need to repent of and I need to seek forgiveness for and seek healing for. But that continual pursuit of healing is a really important part of standing against the racial sickness and brokenness around us. Let me check how we're doing on time. I'm going to recommend another book. I'm a book person. I work for a book publisher, so a lot of my wisdom and things I've learned come from learning from other people. But I really appreciate this book, The Body Keeps the Score. And this quote from that book, when you activate your gut feelings and listen to your heart break, when you follow the interoceptive pathways to your innermost recesses, things begin to change. But see how much work is involved? You have to activate your gut feelings. You have to listen to your heartbreak. You have to follow those pathways back in maybe your memory, your remembering to try to undo some of those instances of trauma and pain, whether you've experienced it or caused it. So change can happen, but it doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen unless you pursue it. So pursuing racial healing is really important. For those of us who are working with kids, raising kids, it's important to ask our kids regularly to create places of safety where we can talk to them about whether or not they've experienced or caused moments of racial pain. When our kids are younger, they can talk about physical pain pretty easily, right? They'll let us know if they've gotten hurt. They don't mind telling parents or caregivers that they need a Band-Aid or they got a cut or they fell down. But racial pain, racial related pain is different. It's usually something that causes kids shame because they don't fully understand it. And they might even think that it's their fault that they experienced it. Or if they caused it, they feel great shame as well. So it doesn't tend to get talked about. I sometimes have not found out about some of the stories I'm telling you today until like many, many years have passed by and my kids feel comfortable enough to share it. So there's a shame element that, again, it's a tool of Satan to try to keep things hidden and to keep things under the wraps so we don't talk about it. Our kids may not understand how to deal with those feelings of shame. So we as adults in their lives, parents, pastors, caregivers, aunts, uncles, grandparents need to take initiative and try to make a safe space for them to talk about it. They might not at first, and they might just kind of say, no, nothing like that's ever happened to me. Um, but if you keep asking over time, stories may come out. So you want to create intentionally those safe spaces in families and in our churches to have those hard conversations. All right. Lastly, strive for, quote, herd multi-ethnicity, unquote. So I'm doing a play on herd immunity by using this phrase, herd multi-ethnicities. So what do I mean by that? This is our little puppy. This is Simba. Simba is our family's first dog ever. We got him during the pandemic, like most people somehow got puppies during the pandemic. And if you have ever had a puppy, you know how important socialization is, right? Like the first 6 months of their life, it's really important that you um, help them meet all kinds of other dogs and get exposure to all kinds of different people and experiences. And you know what? That's the same thing for people too. In this book, Nurture Shock, there are a number of really fascinating studies related to the topic of race, such as infants as young as 3 months old demonstrate that they can observe and detect racial differences between people. And so when they are even by third grade, having a chance to like create categories in their mind, they start to assign value without even realizing it. They start to embrace preferences in terms of understanding and believing that certain racial groups are preferable to others. And these things just happen, again, by virtue of living in our particular country, in our particular cultural context. So if, again, adults in their lives are not explicit about trying to communicate about these kinds of racial categories and making it clear that one is no better than the other. We're all equally valued and equally treasured by God. If those kinds of messages are not clear, then they begin to embrace whatever their cultural context is telling them, what they might be hearing from peers, what they might be picking up from social media or from pop culture. Another study that this particular book articulates, which I just thought was so fascinating, is that just because you're in a diverse setting, like because we are growing up in an increasingly multi-ethnic world, maybe our assumption is that once our kids become more in touch with other kids from different ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds, they'll learn how to get along. Or because we live in a pretty multi-ethnic city and we have our kids go to a pretty multi-ethnic school, they'll learn how to get along. If we're making those assumptions, the science actually shows that does not always happen. Actually, the more diverse a school is, according to Nurture Shock, the more that the kids will self-segregate by race and ethnicity within the school. And thus, the likelihood that kids of different races will have a friendship goes down. Might this same principle apply to your context, your church, your neighborhood, your city? We are becoming a more diverse society, no doubt. So the graph here shows latest census data. On the right, you see the racial backgrounds of adults 18 and over, majority whites, but things are fast changing. On the left, you see the realities for children. Under 18, actually, those who are kids who are white under 18 are in the minority. And this will continue to change as time goes by. That said, as I just mentioned before, the existence of diversity is not a guarantee that all of a sudden racial dynamics will improve. It's not a cut and dry situation that as we become more diverse as a nation, all of a sudden we're all going to get along. We need to continue to work at this. We need to continue to pursue diverse and healthy relationships where these things and issues are talked about explicitly so that, again, there aren't assumptions buried underneath or racial trauma buried in the recesses of our minds and our souls that are undealt with. It takes the next generation watching us model having these conversations, having them in safe spaces, having them in a way where there's no judgment, but there's honesty. And this is all a part of what it means to pursue herd multi-ethnicity. As Christians, we really have to push against what I think is that kind of birds of a feather flock together mentality, which is our nature. Our nature is to want to be with those who are like us. Our nature is to want to be in places that are comfortable, but we have to learn to push against that tendency and to try to develop intentionally diverse relationships. I love if you start reading the Bible with the lens to looking for places, spaces where you see that kind of multi-ethnic interaction and relationship. If you start looking, you will notice it is everywhere. It is everywhere. The early church was an incredibly multi-ethnic group. Just think about the story of Pentecost. In that amazing story, you had people, Jews from every nation, right? They were culturally connected as Jews, but they were ethnically different from all over. And they all came together unified in a just collective praise to God. That is our future ultimately in heaven. And we want to continue to bring that to our witness here on earth. So those are just 4 suggestions. I know so much more could be said, but let me just bring this to a close by taking a look at that beautiful picture in Revelation. We often talk about Revelation 7 when we look at the future of where we're headed as the church. Revelation 7, the picture of every tongue and tribe and nation bowing before God in worship. And I love that picture. But I want actually to highlight for you today Revelation 22. And this is like at the very end of the Bible, where John is writing about what the future looks like. And he's talking about the river of life, and he's talking about the tree of life bearing its 12 crops of fruit. And I just love this last sentence. For some reason, it just caught my eye. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. It's so intriguing to me to hear and to read that even at this point in the history of the world, history of humanity, we are not fully healed, not yet. Even at this point at Revelation 22, it shows how deep the brokenness goes. It shows how much we need just the purity of God's air, his love, his peace, his goodness that can wipe away every tear, every source of pain. We need that kind of context to fully heal. That's what we're going to be. That's where we're going to be in the future. But until then, we have our work cut out for us. Cannot rely on pop culture to bring about the change we want, although it's fun to see that there's more and more change happening in that realm as time goes on. But we are the church, and we are called to bring heaven to earth now. We're called to actively love and be in relationship with others, even those who are very different from us. We're called to teach and train our children to do the same. And as we do this, we can get closer and closer to the healing of all the nations. This is the mission we've been given. This is the call that we have as parents, as pastors, as caregivers for the children in our midst, to bring heaven on earth as much as we can until that great day comes. So may it be so. And thank you so much for your time, for your attention. I think we have a little time left for questions if there are any.
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth wondered, could you provide guidance or resources for those of us raising biracial or bi-ethnic children?
Yeah. So I think if you are a parent who is not yourself biracial and bicultural, I would recommend a wonderful book called Mixed Blessing, written by Chandra Crane, as a way to start understanding the mixed ethnicity journey and what it's like to be a person of mixed heritage. Living in the church and in the US. Chandra is an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship staff worker and has really thought a lot about what it means to have mixed ethnicity heritage. So I would really commend that book as one resource. I'm sure that there are many, many more, but that, if you look at the demographics of our country, the mixed ethnicity group is probably one of the fastest growing group. And of course, much of that growth is happening in the under 18 population. So it's an area that the church needs to continue to grow in terms of providing resources, creating resources. But that's one you can start with for sure.
Can you say that name one more time? I was grabbing the links to
Yeah.
your book, and I always try to do it in real time. I missed it.
So the title is Mixed Blessing, and the
Okay.
author's name is Chandra, Chandra, and the last
Uh-huh.
name is Crane, Crane. It's published by InterVarsity Press. So
Wow.
it's,
I was
yeah,
so
it's
close. I had Kane, Chandra. I had everything right except I
you were
had Chandra.
close. Yeah, yeah.
So close. Okay, great. Do we have other, I'm about to put that link for you all, and I
Mhm.
just put links to the Racewise family. We gave you a link directly to Helen's book website, which also includes some great articles that she's written, as well as a link to IndieBound and to bookshop.org where you can get her book. But you can also get it all the other normal places if you want to, if you're Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target. If you want to go straight to InterVarsity, or is it InterVarsity that published
Yeah,
this one?
it
Okay, yeah.
is. So Mixed Blessing, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you mean
Mixed.
the Racewise family? The Racewise
I meant
family was
Racewise
published.
family.
That
Yes.
was published by Waterbrook.
Okay, there you go. So if you want to go directly to the publisher, I'm sure it's there. And I'm just putting a link for Mixed Blessing. What other questions do we have? There we go. I was wondering, I know that our audience usually includes a lot of church professionals.
Mm.
Have you of people who have used your book or other books for parenting groups that they might want to facilitate either in person or online?
Yeah. So another option that could be a really good parent group kind of conversation along some of these lines is Rediscipling the White Church by David Swanson.
Okay.
He is a pastor with the Evangelical Covenant Church and has really thought about what particular practices do churches and parents need to start incorporating to help prepare their churches and their young ones to live in a more multi-ethnic society. So I would really commend that book as another really great option for a book group. Really thoughtfully written, accessible, and wise.
Do you have any like a study guide that you've seen people use with the Racewise family, or
We have
is that
discussion
included?
questions that
Oh,
go with
great.
the
Perfect.
book.
Right.
Now I cannot remember at the current moment if they are inside the book or if they are available as a PDF. I have a feeling that we put them inside the book, so I'll have to let you. I'll let you know
Yeah,
if it's
sorry, I
not.
don't have it in front of me either. And so
That's
I thought to
okay.
myself, were those in there or not? Okay.
I have a feeling we did them in time that they made it in the book, but if not, they exist. So I'm sure I could get those to you as a file if they are not in the actual book.
Okay, great. All right. Um, Other folks, like I said, we have a number of people here joining with us live. And if you have questions for Helen, this is a great time to get them out there. I really appreciate your thoughtful attention to both personal story and biblical narrative throughout this,
Mm.
as well as research. I mean, it's incredible work that you've
Oh,
done.
thank you.
So,
Hope it was helpful. I mean, I'm just one of many resources. There's lots of resources out there. So I really commend anyone who's interested in trying to further their own knowledge and their growth. There is a lot of good content out there continuing to come on this particular topic. So there's another one that I just saw, actually InterVarsity Press just released this week. It's Doing Nothing is No Longer an Option by Jenny Potter. So she's white. She's a mom who really has grown in her own understanding of issues of race and wants to do more to encourage the church to battle this virus that we've been talking about all day. So that's another book that I would commend to you.
all right, I got that one too. I just grabbed that. There we go. The link there as well. I don't see any questions, but now is a great time if you have one to put it there. But I always like to ask our webinar presenters if there is some words that you'd like, perhaps some words of encouragement or some words you'd like to give us as we close.
Mm. It can be really daunting, I think, for all of us when we think about racism and race-related issues. It seems scary because you don't want to say the wrong thing or make a mistake, and it sometimes maybe can paralyze us from doing anything because it just feels so overwhelming. And I think that's true for so many of the great evils we see around us, the great injustices all around us. And that can, I think, cause us to not do anything at all. So I think my exhortation would be, we are not going to solve this. God has got it all figured out in the end. He's just inviting us to participate alongside the good work he is already doing and continues to do and will continue to bring to completion at the end. So if we reframe even how we think about it, that it's not our problem to solve, that it's not going to be us who solves it all, but that we're being invited to a journey to be a part of the good that God's doing in the world. And even if it's one small little way, one relationship, one area in our own life that we're going to continue to grow in our own understanding, whatever small thing we can do to take those steps forward, one day at a time, one step at a time, that is where to start without feeling like we have this burden or pressure to either get it all right, because we won't, we won't. I don't. um so try to release yourself from that stress and pressure. You might get critiqued, you might get canceled if you say the wrong thing. It happens. But in the end, who are we seeking to please ultimately in our life's journey, right? If we don't worry so much about what people will say and think, if we truly try to stay faithful to the course that God is setting before us, and the church at large, if we can be, again, this is spiritual work. I mean, the best absolute place to start is just on our knees to say, "Oh Lord, I know that this is an area I have ignored. I just haven't spent any time in, or very little. It's been easy for me to ignore for whatever reason, but I feel like you're doing something in me. I feel like you're stirring something in me. Just help me know what the next step is. My next one single step. Help me to be faithful to that one single step." And as you're faithful to those single steps, they will add up to great good in the world, either in your life, in the life of those around you, in the life of the kids you parent or serve or teach. And that all will have eternal impact. So don't be afraid of the small single steps. They all make a difference.
Wow, that's so wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing with us, and thank you for your expertise. Thank you also for sharing the slides. If you just send them, email them to me, I'll create them as a PDF. For any of you who are watching the recording, note that you should be able to find it on our PRC webpage underneath Helen's, underneath the link to this webinar will be a link to that resource. And all of you that are already registered, you're going to get that in your follow-up email. So we're so grateful to you and for your time. And we wish you all days full of peace and purpose. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.